Good evening. I'm Patricia Vanskyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to Pills, Pandemics, and the Poor, Pandemics and Public Policy. Our library was founded in the late 1800s by three pharmacists, the Lloyd brothers, who were committed to making discoveries and promoting health and well-being. Today, scholars and researchers still come to the Lloyd to investigate current situations, as well as gain an understanding from the past. In the last couple of years, it feels like we have a lot to learn about infectious diseases. Tonight's lecture will show us that we aren't alone, and indeed, we have come a long way. Our speaker, Dr. Paul Tenkotte, is a history professor at Northern Kentucky University and director of their Center for Public History. Paul has contributed significantly to our understanding of local history through books like Cincinnati, the Queen City, and the Northern Kentucky Encyclopedia, not to mention his work on 16 television documentaries and award-winning productions. Paul knows public history, but he also knows public policy and public health. In today's program, he'll connect the dots between epidemics, our understanding of them, and public policy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Tenkotte.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for inviting me this evening to talk to all of you about Contagious, Cincinnati. And I'm going now to share my screen with you so that we can enter on this journey. I want to begin, and I'll say this, I have scoured in preparation for tonight 150 years of newspapers. Okay, so I'm exaggerating a little bit until I found the absolutely perfect joke to start out tonight. And it's pretty hard to find a joke when you're dealing with a topic as really is sad sometimes as epidemics. This is from the Cincinnati Daily Times of November 1872, so it's about 150 years old. A lady asked a gentleman who was suffering from influenza, "My dear sir, what do you use for your cold?" He said, "5 handkerchiefs a day, madam." Now, since I can't hear all of you and your raucous laughter, I have to substitute a little emoticon there. Tonight, consider me your kind of Cliff's Notes or Monarch's Notes to really the introduction of what pandemics were. And in that way, I'm going to, like almost a literary work, and I'm certain some of you may have used Monarch Notes or Cliff's Notes when you were in high school or college. I'm going to introduce you to the main characters, first of all. But secondly, we really have to deal with the scenery and set the stage so that we can understand two things. And when we are through this evening, I hope you have a better understanding of public policy. But in particular, I also hope, number two, that you can see the evolution of science, the evolution of the history of healthcare and of medicine. For many, many years, in fact, some would say for thousands of years, the kind of ruling understanding of medicine came from Hippocrates. This is the man that gave his name to the Hippocratic Oath of doctors. And he was from the classical Greek era. And another man who was also Greek, but part of the Roman Empire, called Galen. And they believed in a theory of the 4 humors, which really was based upon the theory of 4 elements. And what this means is that people kind of looked around and said, it looks like when it comes to the living things around us, that everything is either kind of earth, water, air, or fire. Now, that's actually what we call kind of deductive thinking. Deductive thinking goes from some general premise, like just looking around and saying, well, the earth looks like it's composed of 4 elements, and then taking that and expounding upon it to deduce, hence deductive, to deduce other things. Now, the thing to remember about this kind of deductive medicine or any deductive thinking is that it's only as good as and solid as the original premise is. So if you take the original premise being, hey, there are 4 elements that make up the earth, and those 4 elements are broadly represented in humans as the 4 humors, and then you say, oh, and I bet they also have something to do with sickness. And then you say, oh, you deduce it may also have something to do with personalities. I think you all can see where this is heading. Unfortunately, they were wrong about their theories, at least somewhat wrong. So let's see what that actually led to. And you know, it's really fascinating nowadays, because if you go and look up kind of like determine your personality on the internet, there are all kinds of people who have basic kind of basic understanding of this 4 humors and 4 elements, or what were called the 4 temperaments or the 4 personalities, except they've changed the names and they've given their own names to their theories. But just to make things kind of understandable, I'm going to look at Winnie the Pooh with you for a second. Pooh is considered this person who, of course, and I think we need to just backtrack a second here. When we look at this, these 4 elements, you can see that some are considered air, which is the equivalent of blood, which is the equivalent of spring, which is the equivalent of childhood. Then if you go over to water, oh, well, when it comes to humans, that's the equivalent of phlegm. And you can see on through that this whole thing is a system, and it has its relative to all of the temperaments as well. So if you look at Pooh, Pooh is kind of a phlegmatic individual. That means that he was really ruled by phlegm or by the element of water. Tigger was, and you know, if you think of a phlegmatic person, you think, oh, a phlegmatic person is kind of a person who has kind of a lot of mucus, and they seem, you know, when you're sick, you seem phlegmatic, right? You don't seem very energetic. You seem kind of lazy. You just want to lie around, excuse me, in bed all day. Tigger, on the other hand, was ruled by blood. That is air, the element of air. And he was considered, you would consider him to have a sanguine personality, meaning that he was just alive and appreciated everything and was very personable, sanguine in the sense of being optimistic. The rabbit, on the other hand, is ruled by yellow bile, and he's considered, or fire, he's considered choleric. And choleric can mean, okay, and I'm sorry for using this terminology for you, but he can seem a little bit angry at times, or as we would say in colloquial sense, pissed off at things. But he also can be a leader and a commander. In Eeyore, melancholic, ruled by black bile. That is, he's always kind of, and again, sorry for saying this, down in the dumps, so to speak. Now, they actually believed, and this is true in the early 1800s, and even it was considered all the way up through the mid 1800s and the late 1800s in Cincinnati, when we're dealing, at the time we're dealing with many of these epidemics or pandemics. And I'm going to kind of use that terminology of epidemics and pandemics exchangeably, because epidemics are really kind of, well, you could have an epidemic in one particular city, for instance. You could have an epidemic at a school or a certain institution. when we use the word pandemic, we're generally describing like it is all over the place. It is not just in one city, it is worldwide. And we're going to be talking about some of those worldwide pandemics this evening. So what did doctors really do when they tried to treat diseases, including epidemics? Well, they did things like bloodletting. And they did that through opening a vein, which you see depicted here. Usually this was done often by barbers, and they opened a vein. Hopefully they got a vein and not an artery. Sometimes they accidentally got an artery and their patients bled to death. And they also did it through applying leeches to the body. Another way was through cupping, that is taking different sized glass cups, heating them up, and then applying them, and they would suction then to the body, and they would be pulling away things from the body itself. Purgatives, emetics, and emetics were different chemicals, different medicines given to induce vomiting. Enemas, I don't think that needs an explanation. And people would go to certain springs. There was, for instance, south of Cincinnati, a place just outside of the Covington boundaries called Latonia Springs. People would go there to take on the sulfur in other springs, and they would, of course, take that on, drink that, and then run between the hotel and the outhouses. They would also go into bathhouses where things were kept very warm, so that would kind of induce sweating. Now, we all look at this and say, gee, this is so kind of wrong, we say, right? It doesn't seem at all to talk about the ways that infections and diseases are actually passed on in between. What are the vectors? How are they carried? And there were really two theories at that time about how diseases were carried and went from one individual to another. And the one, for a while, actually the less popular of the theories was contagion, illustrated by this little guy who is very ineffectively trying to contain his sneeze in a handkerchief. And unfortunately, most of the droplets are going way beyond the handkerchief. The theory of contagion was that, yes, somehow, and they didn't know how, they didn't understand bacteria, they didn't understand viruses, that people could catch diseases from one another directly. Then there was this really more popular idea, as shown here in a lithograph by Robert Seymour of 1831, of kind of bad air, toxic air that could rise above, say, marshlands or bad areas of the city where there was bad sitting water, or even rivers or streams that had polluted water, and hence that somehow diseases would arise from those kinds of conditions. Well, there was a German physician in the late 1700s and the early 1800s by the name of Samuel Hahnemann, who was actually dissatisfied with the idea of the four humors and of other medical theories of his era. And he began to be considered one of the founders of homeopathy. In fact, it was he that coined the terms allopathic and homeopathic medicine. Now, the interesting thing about medicine in the 1800s in cities like Cincinnati is you had a clear polarization between homeopathic doctors and allopathic doctors. Homeopathic doctors, literally, homeopathic is Greek for like and to suffer. And so it means like cures like. So an example of a homeopathic kind of remedy for something would be if you have, say, you're not able to, say, sleep at night, you have insomnia, and they would actually perhaps prescribe for you a very, very small dose of something that would not make you go to sleep, but something that actually would sort of excite you and absolutely do the opposite. So homeopathic means kind of using very, very small doses of medicines and chemicals where they are very much alike the very thing you're suffering from. Now, allopathic, which was really meant as kind of a derogatory term, because Samuel Hahnemann was a homeopathic doctor and he came up with the terminology. And he was really saying, well, you know, those allopathics, they're using medicines and things that are opposite what a person is suffering from. So for instance, if you had insomnia, they would have prescribed something that would have made you feel a little tired, more restful, so that you could, in fact, sleep at nights. Now, all of this seems to come to a head and to a tipping point during the Civil War in the United States. And I think something which is absolutely astounding to realize, but probably would shock most of us when first hearing about it, is that 600,000 to 700,000 people died during the Civil War in the United States. And that includes both in the North and the South. But 2/3 of those people did not die from battle wounds, they died from disease. Doctors were not well trained at that time. There were over 40 medical schools, but basically what a medical school consisted of is 2 terms of 6-month lectures. So you went to school for about a year or so, and then you apprenticed yourself to a doctor. Even the armies themselves, both in the North and the South, had very few doctors when the Civil War began. And while they would recognize the neutral status of surgeons, many of the doctors that both the North and the South used were not only appointed and in the armies themselves, but even more so, especially in the case of the South of the Confederacy, were contracted doctors. Now, another interesting thing about the Civil War is that you had a lot of men in the service, in the armies in both the North and the South, who were from rural areas. They were not from populated areas, and they had not been exposed to many of the diseases that one can get through contagion and through bad kind of sanitary conditions. So they were exposed to all kinds of childhood diseases like measles, which could be deadly at that time, and to chicken pox. Many were exposed to smallpox. And although there was a vaccine for that, many of those soldiers had not been vaccinated against smallpox. And there was poor food and unsanitary conditions. So things like typhoid fever, which is caused when food or water is contaminated by salmonella, and diarrhea and dysentery, dysentery literally being bloody diarrhea, tuberculosis, yellow fever, scarlet fever, pneumonia often overtook the camps. And you will find, if you do genealogy, say, of someone's family who had Civil War soldiers, that and look through the records, that many times they might be sent to hospital or sick bed, and they suffered from many of these diseases. The field hospitals themselves in the Civil War acted like triage units, trying to determine the difference between 3 categories: mortally wounded people, slightly wounded people, and surgical cases. Interestingly, 95% of the surgeries performed were with anesthesia, and they used either ether or chloroform. But there was no such thing back in those days as intubation, where, doctors, surgeons could take over the breathing of the patients. So therefore, you could only give as much anesthesia like ether or chloroform, and it might only be a few minutes worth. So sometimes literally these surgeons actually had to be pretty quick and pretty skilled in doing what they did. There were many amputations in both the North and the South, and the mortality rate from gangrene was very high. And although they kind of began to understand the importance of not reusing dressings, and although they later on would apply nitric acid to clean wounds, in many respects, they were just taking scalpels and instruments and just wiping them clean with a rag that would be used again and again from one surgery to another. So you can imagine how things were, there was no understanding then really of germs or in terms of bacteria or of viruses. That doesn't mean that there weren't people that were ready and able to even sacrifice themselves and put themselves in danger in order to help the masses of soldiers that needed help. And there was a U.S. Sanitary Commission that had a very active chapter in Cincinnati, composed of very many women. And after the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, there was such an epidemic of measles occurring among the men who survived that battle, as well as so many injuries for that battle, that the U.S. Sanitary Commission of Cincinnati actually, through a wonderful lady called Sarah Worthington King Peter, depicted here, and Sister Anthony O'Connell, a sister of charity of Cincinnati, called by the soldiers the Angel of the Battlefield, actually went with a number of nuns, dozens of nuns, and a Dr. Blackman on a boat, the steamboat Superior, bringing care to the wounded and the sick and dying at the Battle of Shiloh. Civil War medicine things will change at the time of the Civil War. Again, this is a tipping point. There were no nursing schools in the United States before the Civil War. The best nurses around were Catholic nuns, as we've just seen. Dorothea Dix was a very noted humanitarian leader that established the Office of Army Nurses, which included, by the way, Black women. Over 21,000 women received pay for serving as nurses, cooks, laundresses, etc. And the one thing I want to kind of leave the Civil War with is an understanding that Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, they were among the areas that were home to many, many hospitals to treat the sick and wounded of the Civil War. So on a regular basis, almost a daily basis, train loads of sick and wounded Union soldiers came into Cincinnati. It came into Covington, and they'd be ferried across the river to Cincinnati, or they arrived by steamboat. And there literally were 13, well, one of them wasn't used, 12 hospitals that were taking care of Civil War soldiers. Now, that's all part of what we might call medicine's deductive era thinking, which you recall means he's starting with an idea, and you really don't know if that idea is right or wrong, but you continue to elaborate upon it and deduce one thing after another. Well, we live in an era where we know what bacteria are and we know what viruses are. And so, in essence, you already know the plot of the story and the end of the story. What you might not realize is how the story developed. So already in the 1600s, there were microscopes, and Europeans were looking in those microscopes and viewing bacteria, which look worm-like, and they thought they were just like little worms. We also know that throughout the world, and certainly by the 1600s in places like China, they were vaccinating people for smallpox, and that this would be picked up in Britain with Edward Jenner, and it would be picked up in the United States and in places like here in our own Fort Washington in Cincinnati. But still, things were not quite moving in the direction that they needed to move in order to control the many other epidemics that would come to Cincinnati and other places. Things only start changing shortly before the Civil War, but mainly after the Civil War. One of the very important characters in the history of medicine is 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian. And he noticed that so many women suffered from childhood fever after they gave birth. And this postpartum condition would actually lead to the deaths of many mothers. And he said, well, what we have to do is make certain that we wash our hands, that the people who deliver the babies in the hospital wash their hands. The doctors oftentimes were coming from other surgeries, and they often prided themselves on the fact that, you know, their white coats and so forth were filled with all kinds of things, you know, that they had worked a hard day. And by doing this, he actually reduced childhood fever to a tremendous respect. But many people, you know, thought, no, we don't believe that can't be. And so the Civil War occurs and there are not sanitary conditions. It's Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, one French and one British, that start to experiment with, and I think this is very important because experimentation, the idea of the scientific method where you experiment and you draw conclusions from that and theories from that, is certainly evidence of the scientific method being used and of inductive thinking. One of those great scientists of the late 1880s who really discovered the bacteria responsible for anthrax and for septicemia and for TB or tuberculosis. His name was Robert Koch. And Koch, and this is very interesting, his first American student was James Whittaker, who was born in Cincinnati. James Whittaker was born in Cincinnati. His father had a store right on the riverfront. And sometime in the 1840s, his father moved to Covington. So James Whittaker attended what is now Holmes High School, what was then called Covington High School. He was a brilliant student who attended probably the best medical school of the time in the United States, the University of Pennsylvania. He also attended, before that, Miami University, and he would later on study, once he was already a doctor, under Robert Koch, bringing back to Cincinnati. And when he was working as a professor at the Cincinnati College of Medicine, which is now University of Cincinnati School of Medicine, he brought back certainly these ideas that Robert Koch had of the spread of disease through bacteria. We also know that the idea of 4 elements, of course, people knew that there were many more elements even back in the Middle Ages, but that grows with the periodic table of the elements also in about 1869, when Dmitri Mendeleev really introduces the first periodic table of the elements, which is arranged by atomic weights. Now, that's for bacteria. What about for viruses? Viruses are actually smaller than bacteria. Well, the fascinating thing was Louis Pasteur, this Frenchman, who we know for pasteurization, couldn't find a bacteria for rabies. And he theorized that that was because the bacteria was so small that the microscopes of the time could not detect it. In the 1880s, a Frenchman actually invented a filter through which bacteria would be trapped. They would not pass, but viruses that were smaller did. And through this, and through replicating viruses without even yet seeing them, scientists knew that something smaller than the bacteria viewed in microscopes was out there. And some people began to call these viruses, although it would not be until 1931 that the invention of electron microscope enabled Europeans to see viruses. So now, after all of that, we know that the 1860s and 70s and 80s are going to be watershed years where they're going to come to an understanding of how epidemics, what are the vectors for the spread of epidemics. And once they know what causes them and what the vectors are, they can do something about preventing them through vaccination and through improving sanitary conditions. So I created a couple little comic sketches for you to make it a little more cheery and also perhaps a little more understandable. So far as bacteria in the human body, I have the first frame there that shows a beneficial bacterial buffet. So I think all of us know by now that our digestive system depends upon millions, literally millions of bacteria. These are beneficial bacteria, and they have a symbiotic relationship with us. We provide them with all kinds of nourishment in our intestines, our small and large intestines. And in return, they help us break things down into sugars and so forth for the production of proteins necessary for life. So what I'm showing there is a little bacteria, and he's saying, yum, yum, tasty treats await. You're welcome. And the tasty treats await are for him, you know, not that bacteria have any gender. And he's also referring to things like yogurt and other things that we're encouraged to eat that do contain healthy, beneficial bacteria for proper digestion. Now that differs a lot from pathogenic bacteria, which are only going to do harm to our bodies. An example of a pathogenic bacteria is cholera. And cholera epidemics were among the worst epidemics of the 1800s and among the worst that visited Cincinnati and environs on a regular basis. So here I show you the digestive system, and I have a little more cruel looking bacteria, or bacterium, excuse me, the singular, saying, hey buddy, I suggest parking yourself here. You'll need it. Cholera was a rampant epidemic that would appear every so often, as we're going to see here soon. Now, I'm going to concentrate on two things for the rest of the evening. One is cholera, which was bacterial, and the other one, influenza, which is viral. I can't by any means approach all the other epidemics in Cincinnati. There would be too many of them, and it would be an entire course rather than just 40 minutes. But I am going to talk a little bit about viral villains, and I went ahead and prepared another little comic strip for you. So here you see the little virus with his protein spikes, and he's getting ready to attack this person's respiratory system, as viruses often do. Now he's already attacked. He's inside. He's sitting down in this comfy chair, and he says, I've hijacked this comfy human respiratory cell. And I think hijack is a good term, because viruses generally cannot reproduce. Unlike bacteria, some, they cannot reproduce on their own. Instead, they have to hijack animal, human, other cells in order for their RNA to work, their genetic code to work, to trick us, and then they will multiply rapidly. And so here the virus has moved into our respiratory cell bedroom, turned down the lights, and said, close the door. I have some reproductive tasks to do. So what is bacterial or viral? And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is an example of all of the things we could have talked about. And many of these have vaccines. And I've given information as to who came up with those vaccines. There was a wonderful scientist called Maurice Hilleman who came up with like 8 of the kind of vaccinations that now children receive, childhood vaccinations. He has literally, through his genius, saved millions, if not billions, of people worldwide. Notice that pneumonia can be called either by a bacteria or by a virus. Now, the first thing was caused by bacteria. And although overall it was not as deadly as some epidemics were, it was frightening because of how rapid it was. Literally from experiencing the first symptoms to death. Sometimes it would take people in only 4 to 8 hours, and that frightened people. There were large cholera epidemics in Cincinnati in 1832 and 1849. And the most that doctors had were a couple of things: calomel, opium, camphor, to kind of deal with people's suffering. There was great resistance between. So if we talk about polarization today, say for instance with COVID and how it might be cured, there was great polarization between the homeopathic doctors we talked about and the allopathic doctors. One of those doctors was Dr. S.A. Latta of Cincinnati, and he wrote a little book called The Cholera in Cincinnati, or A Connected View of the Controversy Between the Homeopathies and the Methodist Expositor. That was a magazine. And basically, Dr. Latta was an allopathic doctor, and he got really upset when homeopathic doctors in Cincinnati said, well, we treated our patients with this, this, and this, and we had a very small mortality rate. He questioned that. He basically called their evidence and their data false, hence fake. And so the questioning was there. The blaming people for the virus. A lot of people blamed immigrants and the poor, who generally lived in dirty, unventilated living conditions. And because cholera is actually spread often through infected water or dirt, so you ingest it either in food or generally polluted water, Cincinnati's water supply was doing nothing to help the situation. Cincinnati was already an industrializing city. They were throwing waste into the rivers, and Cincinnati's water supply was drawn directly from the river and was polluted by toxins. Historian Ted Eversole, in a Queen City Heritage article in fall 1983, concluded that the epidemic in Cincinnati of 1849 produced little change in either public attitude, civic responsibility, or in the general public health program of Cincinnati. Meanwhile, the 1850s would pass, and other people like Dr. John Snow of London, England, would notice that unsanitary water seemed to be the vector. In many ways, however, it took the Cincinnati cholera epidemic of 1866, only a year after the Civil War ended, to see really a sea wave of change. There was disinfection. The city by that time had sanitary police, and they disinfected all kinds of things. Look at here in this little report here, where this week they noticed how many bottles of medicine they gave away to the poor, how much disinfectant they distributed, and how they went around and they disinfected 2 streets, 4 alleys, 141 premises, people's homes or businesses. So they were actually taking productive, inductive method, scientific method steps to stop through disinfection the spread of cholera. They also set up a special cholera hospital conducted by the Sisters of Mercy. And if you notice here, they start keeping very good statistics. The Sisters of Mercy admitted 53 patients, 25 died, 20 were discharged, there were 8 remaining. So look at the amount of statistics. People are hoping through the scientific method and the use of scientific method, we will study and study and study, and then something will appear to enable us to approach this. The Cincinnati cholera epidemic of 1873 was vastly studied. The scientific method was used, statistics were gathered. They even knew how the cholera arrived in Cincinnati. It arrived aboard a steamer, the John Kilgore, which is shown here, not in Cincinnati, someplace else, which came from New Orleans, had 3 patients of cholera who died en route, and they landed in Cincinnati in May of 1873. Dr. J.J. Quinn of the Cincinnati Board of Health, after the cholera was over, conducted an exhaustive 82-page study. And if you look here, he has tables showing when someone died, what their age, sex was, what their race was, where they lived, how long they had the attack. And he goes through and traces from the time the John Kilgore came into the public landing. The first cases were a distance, say, of 6,950 feet from the first case, and goes ahead and sees how the spread is actually occurring. This is when science starts to make great progress. But it makes the most progress in Cincinnati when the Russian flu pandemic hits in 1889-90. It was a very scientific approach. The newspapers were covering the path of progression of this influenza from India and Russia to New York City and New Orleans to the first death in Cincinnati. And people and scientists were taking samples from patients, trying to determine if they could see the bacteria. They thought they saw the bacteria, but what they probably saw was the bacteria of a secondary infection. This is a very scientifically studied approach. And the amazing thing about the Russian flu is hardly anyone talks about it. In fact, flu was just kind of a minor ailment of the 19th century. It was like it is today. It was problematic, but it didn't kill many people. But this flu did. This flu was different. And after COVID appeared in 2019, researchers around the world began to study the Russian influenza, and they feel that that pandemic was actually caused by a human coronavirus like COVID. Even more significant, it probably was the first human coronavirus, OC43, to split from a bovine, that is a cow coronavirus. The last thing I want to look at quickly here is what all of us know about. Hardly any of us probably heard, including me, about the Russian influenza till I started to explore this. But we know about the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918-1920. No one is certain how many died worldwide. The estimates are 20 million to 100 million. We know that it started appearing, because this was World War I, in both German and US Army camps among their soldiers. But they said nothing about it because they didn't want to give that kind of information out in wartime. Instead, the only country really reporting the outbreak was Spain. So Spain was sort of blamed with it by earning the name Spanish influenza, when in fact, it probably began in the United States. They did everything they could in Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport to stop the spread. Flu patients were quarantined at home. The very sick were to be sent to General Hospital. And the cities of Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport all enacted closures of schools, churches, theaters, and large gatherings. I want to end by saying something, and that is, people wonder why all of a sudden COVID could become so frightening to us. If COVID had occurred as a similar coronavirus did in the Russian flu epidemic of 1889-90, people then would have been frightened. But to be quite honest, mortality rates were very high, especially among children in the 1800s and the 1900s. The specter, that is the ghost of epidemics, was always somewhere around the corner, ready to strike at any time. People were accustomed, I hate to say it, we should never become accustomed to epidemics or pandemics. And two stories from my grandparents exhibit this. My grandparent, Harry F. Tenkotte, lived with his mother and father and siblings in a very crowded part of Cincinnati, East 12th Street and over the Rhine. Slowly over the years, this was before even the Spanish influenza, he lost first his mother and father and all of his siblings except for a sister. And his sister was not old enough to take care of him. So little Harry went to live with an uncle and his wife in Covington. That's how our family came to the Northern Kentucky side of the river. But he always told us that this specter of illness, you never knew. You could come home as he did from school and find a sibling, a brother or a sister who was sick in the morning, dead by the time you came home from school. My maternal grandparents, August and Catherine Meyer, did experience all of the woes of the Spanish influenza. So in the Spanish influenza, my grandfather and grandmother, August and Catherine Meyer, became ill, as did 3 of their children, and all 5 went to St. Elizabeth Hospital. 4 of them came home, August and Catherine and 2 of their children. And my grandmother, who was from a poor family and who herself had been sent to an orphanage at one time and experienced many pains and sorrows in her life, always said that the most difficult of the many sorrows she had in her life, and she didn't go on and talk about her sorrows. She was always a happy, optimistic person. Don't get the wrong impression. But she said of the many things that happened to her in her life, the worst was going into a hospital with all of your children and leaving without one of them. I'm more than happy to take questions.
Hi, Paul. That was really fascinating. And talk about taking us from ancient history all the way, well, to 1918, 1919, and some interesting and very relevant points for today. While we're waiting to see if any chat questions come in from our audience, there were a couple of things that you said that I found really profound. One was the whole idea of deductive reasoning, and that if our assumptions aren't correct, everything from there on out can be a little bit askew, or maybe a lot askew. And one of the things that occurred to me, you were differentiating between bacteria and virus, and talking about how at one time they didn't even know about the concept of virus. We also know that at one time bacteria wasn't even known, as you mentioned, the whole germ theory for disease. What do you think the likelihood is that there is going to be a third or a fourth or other models to explain? I'm here, I'm asking you not to be a historian, but a fortune teller, a look at the future. But what do you think the likelihood is that we're going to have a different model or an extra model, or we discover that there is something in addition to viruses and bacteria or something like that?
Well, that is a wonderful question. And I think it leads to the discovery that we already know of, based upon the human genome process, literally of being able to identify and map all of the genes along the 23 chromosomes of, in the DNA, the twisted DNA, you recall that DNA helix, that we've already entered into that world, in the sense that genetic modification, a lot of what still bothers all of us and affects many of us, are the kind of chronic diseases, not the episodal or epidemic diseases so much, which have really been cut down through the use of vaccination and the achievement of really immunization in communities and in countries and even worldwide, like the disappearance of smallpox. What we're looking at now are those kind of chronic conditions. They might be arthritis, or they could be things like Alzheimer's, or diabetes, or heart disease, or lung disease, or cancer, or any number of other ailments that will be able, and already are able, to genetically modify. So, I mean, sometimes that genetic modification involves the introduction of genes through viruses, because viruses are so effective at literally taking hold and hijacking a cell. And if they can be programmed with the right genes, then certain genetic diseases can. So I look forward to the day. I look forward to the day where all of us, and nearly all of us by a certain age, will have some chronic condition, will be able to actually learn from what we know about bacteria and viruses. And I think you make a great segue to the fact that if we didn't know what bacteria and viruses were, and we would not be at the place we are and how they operated to do genetic modifications. The perfect example of that is how quickly they could unravel the genetic code of COVID-19, and how, once that information became available to scientists around the world, how they could produce a lot of the vaccines are mRNA, which are messenger RNA vaccines, which literally deliver to our cells the message that this looks a little bit like COVID. It's not COVID, but it gets your immune system to practice, right? To send out the T cells and the B cells, and to discover those and to develop at least a short-term immunity. So that in itself is fascinating. If I had it all, if I'm reincarnated, I guess I would want to be involved in that research.
Well, before I get to a question from Carol, I just also want to comment that what an important grasp of science and medicine and the human body that you have to have People don't necessarily think of historians as scientists. Did you ever think when you started your pursuit of history that science would be such an important part of it? Or is that something that sort of came along later?
Um, and in a wonderful world, my mother would have been very happy if I had pursued, for a very short time, I was, pre-medicine. And if I would have pursued that and become a medical doctor versus a PhD doctor, she was proud of me either way, but I've always retained an interest in that. And I have a lot of relatives who are doctors and nurses and the like. I'm fascinated by it all because I think what history tries to do is connect the dots, and connecting the dots between things and enabling us to see a clear path. This kind of analysis and synthesis is the heart of what critical thinking is all about. And we as a society need to practice critical thinking in as many ways as we can, because we live in this fast food, everything's fast society that doesn't exactly set a stage for good critical thinking. And I've noticed that when you approach topics like science, which can be very logical and involve critical thinking, that students react in a very positive way, and that they learn, this method of the scientific method is critical thinking. So I think it helps all of us, because that same critical thinking we can apply to the public, to public policies as well.
Well, I want to get to Carol's question. She asked about the Russian flu, which when you and I first talked was new to me as well. She wanted to know, did the Russian flu kill a lot of people in Cincinnati area, and did people quarantine?
Yes, they did quarantine, and but there wasn't that I know of, or I've been able to find any forced closures, like for this week or for 2 weeks, we're going to shut down churches. I did not notice anything like that at all. The discovery of how people died, the reason why there's such a wide variance, say in the Spanish flu. I mean, that's a big wide variance. 20 million or 100 million died. And that's because nobody really knows. There weren't the tests to say, yes, this was the thing, right? Because they didn't have testing for viruses at that time, right? Now we can test people and say they have COVID, right? But what really kills someone? Is it the Russian flu, or was it simply because the people were already maybe frail or older, and as we get older, our immune systems are not as robust as they once were when we were younger? Or were they very young? And again, children can be very susceptible to these sorts of things. What they did notice about and I know I'm switching back and forth, and I apologize, Carol. What they did notice about the Spanish influenza is, instead of having kind of, when you map it on a graph, a U curve, many viruses have a U curve. So when you look at it in age is along here, the x-axis, and then, mortality is along here, the y-axis, you'll see that younger people often die more in influenza epidemics and other epidemics, and so do older people. But the curve begins to flatten out for middle-aged people. They noticed the opposite of that with the Spanish influenza, that there were more people in their 20s and 30s dying. Now, it's always sad when anyone dies, but when a society has people in their prime, and that is their procreative prime and their working prime, et cetera, dying, that becomes especially unnerving to some policymakers. Your question, Carol, is the question that I would really like to know. I would like to know how many people died in the cholera epidemic of 1832 in Cincinnati, 1849, 1866, 1873, the Russian flu, the Spanish influenza. And I just don't think there's any good way to attain those numbers. There are mortality numbers. And again, you're going to deal with what was the primary cause of death, what was the secondary cause of death, and simply they didn't know. So if I were giving this maybe a year or two from now, maybe I'll discover some more information from the Board of Health and their records that might enable me to at least give ballpark numbers. And ballpark numbers would really be nice to have, you know, like if I had a table of, well, they said this many people died of this, and this many people died of that, and this many people, and this many people were living in Cincinnati, that would be really helpful. I don't have those yet, but thank you. Thank you for asking that question. That is probably my number one thing that I would like to see.
Paul, something came to mind when you were talking about all of this, that for me, that with COVID, so much of the information, and for some people, misinformation that people got was through the media or social media. Of course, there wasn't social media in the 19th century. How did people communicate about the various diseases that were going on and preventative measures like perhaps quarantine? Was that something that was ever addressed in the newspapers, or was it really just something that people amongst themselves talked about?
Another wonderful question. They did talk about it. They'd write letters to the editor and they'd say, we don't need a quarantine and we don't want a quarantine. This was when they were considering quarantines for other things in the 1800s. And largely they were worried about the business and the economy. And back in those days, everything was the newspaper, right? The daily newspapers, and daily newspapers like bought subscriptions to other daily newspapers. So, and they would be more than happy to say, the Cincinnati papers would be more than happy to say, I mean, it was a little strange, like, wow, they really have a bad case of cholera in New Orleans and in St. Louis, but we don't. And then they would actually run an article from a St. Louis, Missouri newspaper, how bad the cholera is. Oh, well, it's okay here. You can come here. And they didn't want to get too much information in the newspapers because they were afraid that it would affect the trade, the number of people coming to Cincinnati to buy goods, to sell goods. People really would begin to worry. And then you would have doctors say, well, it really doesn't do any good necessarily to go out into the country and to leave the city. So, you know, there are always these economic pressures, which, by the way, we experience too with COVID.
Right. Well, Paul, I'm seeing chats from our audience, finding your program fascinating and very interesting. And I have to say, I couldn't agree more. I'd like to thank you again for coming. And I would like to thank the audience as well. You can watch this on YouTube, as was mentioned at the beginning of the program. Check our website, follow us on social media for more interesting topics, including that of the history of medicine. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you, Patricia.